All right. With that, then, of course, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, and we would request that everybody adhere to the code of conduct. I expect that everybody's familiar with it at this point in the project, but it summarizes to be kind and respectful, good people to each other. So this is a Q&A session for folks who are interested in steering committee and the nominees. We have six nominees this year. And it's important for folks to have a chance to ask some questions, understand what they're signing up for, because there's only so much that we can record in a README or a charter document or markdown. And if we're going to empower folks to step to these sorts of volunteer positions, we should make sure that they're doing it in an informed way and understanding what they're getting into. Not that it's anything bad or complicated exactly, but that people can be comfortable and confident. So I see that Cece's on the line. I don't want to put you on the spot exactly, but you're obviously welcome and encouraged to ask questions as you have them. I think I'll start with opening the floor to questions, and if it's super quiet, then maybe we'll do sort of a round robin amongst the steering members and have them share something that they'd like to share. So anything anybody wants to ask first off?
I'm not sure. Am I the only one who self-nominated and busy in this Q&A session?
I believe you might be, at least from what I saw.
Oh, great. Maybe that's because I'm still new to the community and I have too many questions than others. But yeah, I'll take this opportunity to ask some questions if possible. Yeah, since I'm not sure. I just decided to run this morning, and I sent out the issue just this morning. Thank you so much. I would love to learn about like the experience you've been through, like within the steering committee, and how, like, I don't know how it feels like for you guys.
Okay, well, I can start. So I'm in my second term on the steering committee, so I've been on the committee for 3 years. My experience has been that the job requires both more time than you think it does, and it requires a lot more of the like the human skills side of things than you probably think it does, or at least that's like externally visible. It's a job that requires, honestly, I think the thing that it requires most of is empathy, more than any other skill, because a lot of the things that steering does, like at least in my experience, like the simple things are all kind of taken care of. Like, we know what a SIG is. We know kind of how we organize our work. The technical decisions are all delegated to the proper technical leaders. So like steering doesn't really get involved in technical decisions unless it's like we have no idea who is the technical owner for a particular thing. Steering, please find us one. But a lot of the problems that end up surfacing up to steering are the human related ones of like, we don't know where something like ownership for a particular thing should lie. We don't have the things that we need, like we don't have the right people in the right areas, as well as maintaining and fostering relationships between the Kubernetes community and other communities like the CNCF, other projects, other open source communities. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that's not necessarily as easily visible as a lot of the other kinds of work. So I guess that's the thing that at least surprised me the most about coming on to steering is there's plenty of time that you need to spend that's like the visible stuff that you see steering committee members being involved in. But there is a surprising amount of like less visible things that are like coordinating with other communities. Like we, an example would be we meet regularly and exchange ideas with like the OpenStack folks, and not necessarily on specific technical things, but it's on like how do you solve like weird governance problems? Like how are you approaching, what's your thought process on a particular thing, kind of like sharing ideas back and forth and stuff like that. So I'm sure there's other things, I'm sure other steering committee folks can kind of chime in, but it's at least the was maybe one of the more surprising aspects of it for me the last few years that I've been on the committee.
Thank you so much for the sharing.
Let's go to Jordan. Jordan is one of the long timers, and Stephen and I as newcomers can chime in too.
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of what Christoph said. I think the liaison role has expanded, or it sort of got created and then expanded over the past couple of years. So that each steering member sort of has a set of SIGs or community groups. They might be SIGs or committees or working groups that they are like trying to reach out one-on-one to, both to sort of signal boost initiatives or information from steering to those groups, but then also to try to feel out how are things going? Is there anything you need? And so that that has sort of expanded in the past couple of years. I think that's a positive thing, and that ties into what Christoph was saying with sort of the human element. Like we're all drowning in GitHub notifications and inboxes, and so just because there was a like this is super important announcement sent like 4 times to a mailing list doesn't mean that anyone saw it, as you know, as Release League. And so just trying to be a human face on things information we're trying to get across the project, or questions that we have of community group leaders across the project. So in terms of time, I have like a dedicated slot in my calendar weekly, where it's like a 2-hour slot every week that's just blocked off for like steering stuff. And so some weeks everything fits inside that slot, some weeks it doesn't, but that is sort of a regular reminder to sort of go through the backlog and things that aren't urgent and screaming for attention, but still like need to get attention. So that was helpful for me to kind of have both a time bound, but also like a regular prod to be like, okay, I should take the time to reach out to my liaison groups or review open issues or write that doc I said I was going to write, stuff like that.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, I again echoing what Christoph and Jordan said. A lot of this is unexpected time. I think some of the work that we do is at times bursty, at times signal interrupty. There are urgencies that maybe don't exist on the surface, whether it's again interfacing with these various community groups. An example could be the annual reports, right? So the liaisons are partially responsible for those too, making sure that those get in and kind of moving SIGs through the process. Again, this is I think it's important to continue stressing that this is like, it's not a technical role. It's not a technical role. It is very much a human role. It is making sure that the bones of the project are in good footing, right? And really, I think part of this, some of this is chartered to contributor experience, but I think really it's everyone's charter to make sure that this project is, help this project be successful, help coach and steer new leaders within the project or existing leaders within the project. So yeah, again, this is like so much of this is human interaction as opposed to as opposed to technical. There's also, elements of it where, answering these questions that don't necessarily have answers, or the answers are maybe assumed. Examples include, some discussions around the D&O insurance for standing committee members, right? Are we protected in executing our duties, right, by some set of bodies? Like funding is another one that we take care of, right? So, can we get this account? Maybe it's a 1Password, maybe it's Netlify, maybe it's, and like, things like Netlify are maybe ceded to being handled by like CNCF, program management. But there are often times where, maybe someone needs an Apple developer account or something like that, right? Where there's certain things that, like, hey, this is not a thing that we had before. This is not in our support infrastructure for the community. Someone needs to go investigate that, right? And maybe that may be contributor experience. Maybe that's on the steering side. So there are lots of little things that are happening in the background to make sure that we are actually supporting the community. And then I think outside of that, acting as we're partially a voice for the community, right? If so you're familiar now, having done the release team lead stuff, that there are like CNCF webinars that you do, and the press may want to speak to you, and those are things that the steering committee will also do, right? So if it for the sake of maintainers within CNCF projects, Kubernetes has scores, hundreds of maintainers really across across all of the SIGs and sub-projects. But for the CNCF definition of maintainer, that the people who go on the spreadsheet, that's the steering committee, right? So things related to, the submissions for, submissions for KubeCon, for example, will come to us. Conversations around, voting on various issues for, say, CNCF, TOC, or GB may be floated across our desk, right? So I'm yapping now, but lots of things. Again, I think a lot of them are the things that people don't see every day. So there are lots of interesting things behind the curtain that you discover once you join the body.
Yeah, I heard like serving in the steering committee is a lot similar with serving in the release lead. As a release lead, like a lot of coordination work, like including like maintaining relationship maybe between other project or CNCF, and also maybe like funding or financial side of the project as well. But I'm just curious, like, since I know all of you are like super technical strong, and like which part of the job, and this job, as like all of you mentioned, is not very technical side. So I'm just curious, like which part of the job like particular interest to you at the very beginning, and does that part changed like after you actually worked in this area?
So I'll give a couple thoughts on that. First, you can think of the project as roughly 10 years old. It's a successful and mature, mostly, project, right? So what's missing, I think that's where leadership is required to look at what could be missing. And we're talking about the liaisoning, and you really know firsthand from being release lead that it's not just sort of echoing message. You can't just sort of say, hey, go look at issue number, whatever. You got to actually establish the relationship. And that's about bridge building more than just sort of echoing messages. And the bridge building then is human to human, project to project, subparts of projects, foundations, all of those things. And for me, that's something that I've started to find at least as fun as the technical side of things. Like after some point, the coding problems all seem fairly familiar. I mean, there's still invention and innovation going on, but there's only so many projects that you can enable block storage for, or IPv6, or like you start to see these patterns over and over again, and they need done, but there's other things that need done also. And that part is a new and different challenge for me. So yeah, I feel like as somebody who's been around the industry for almost 3 decades now, I feel like it's partly my responsibility. The last KubeCon, somebody was walking by me and there was a conversation, they had a question, and they turned to me and were like, hey, librarian, how did we do such and such? And it was like an honor kind of to know that like I'm not just old, but I'm old and I can remember stuff and have some useful context maybe to bring to a situation. And not that we're always bound by the past, but to be informed by it at least. And I feel like that there's a calling in that from a leadership perspective to not just focus on writing the code, make sure that that stuff's getting done too, but the other parts, some of us need to step to those across our careers as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, as you said, yeah, I feel like a leadership level kind of maintaining work for the project is very important. And people like serve this role because they really care about like Kubernetes and also the community. And I'm not sure if I have like other questions. I guess like you like the sharing earlier like almost covered like all the questions around like the job itself, the details. Yeah, just curious, like, I don't know, like what would you like expect for like another member of steering committee would have?
One of the things that I really look for and that you're exhibiting by being here is just engagement, opinions, thoughts, a willingness to ask a question and offer a viewpoint. I think there's been sort of a theme around sort of we're challenged with hard problems, and those we really have to then all express what we're thinking and feeling and work through what the problem is and what might a solution be, and not necessarily be tied to our own opinion, but be open to hearing what the others say and know that we're going to be challenged in that probably, and that there's not an easy answer. So the willingness just to engage in conversation is a really key initial point. And I think that goes back to people having mentioned empathy and human skills. Christoph?
Yeah, just to add to that, the job is definitely a mix of like, you know, at this level, the steering committee is a representative democracy. Like we can't have for some of these like complex, difficult stuff, you know, we can't have the entire, 10,000 plus folks that have contributed to Kubernetes and weigh in on every exact decision. But it is a mix of like both your own personal viewpoints to bring to it and your own like personal perspective and history. And at least in my experience in steering, like everybody who has participated in the number of different iterations of the committee that I've been on has brought their own kind of unique perspectives and background and like coming from different parts of the project and surfacing those perspectives up. But it also requires a certain degree of listening to the rest of the community, and to where different people from different backgrounds having different experiences. There's a lot of people who are engaged in the project now. Like I think I've been a maintainer now on the project for about 5 years or so. There's many of the people who have risen to or either like participating very heavily or in leadership positions and SIG leadership positions and stuff, are people who didn't even know about Kubernetes 5 years ago, or like weren't actively working on Kubernetes, and have like come into the project at different points as we've grown, and trying to listen to that kind of evolution of perspective on where not just where Kubernetes is right now, but where is it going to go in the next 5 years? Where do people kind of see it being driven? And there's a lot of commentary around, people have said like Kubernetes is going to become like the kernel. It's going to become slow and boring, and there's going to be all these like extension points and that kind of stuff. I'll say if Kubernetes itself as a product and kind of where it sits in the tech stack of different companies, as that ends up evolving, the kinds of people that are going to contribute to Kubernetes will change and hopefully grow. like we're expanding the availability and making it easier to get involved in the Kubernetes community, or at least trying to maintain a certain level of ease as far as getting involved as as more people just become knowledgeable in the project and what it can do. As that evolves, the kinds of people and the demographic and the diversity of those folks is going to hopefully expand. And there's a lot of this job that has to do with just like listening and like listening to that kind of pulse that's coming from the community and being able to respond to it, both in addressing challenges that end up coming up, but also highlighting successes, and not just looking at things of like, well, this is the way we've always done it, or this is the way that, you know, like Joe Beta or Tim Hawken or like people who have been around for quite some time, like the way that they've prescribed it. Because if you go and talk to them, they will say like, some of this stuff we just made up. Like there wasn't a better thing, so we just picked a thing so that we had a way to end up moving forward. And all of the folks who've kind of been around and in leadership positions of the project, and all the emeritus steering committee folks, will all say like, we did the best that we could at that particular point in time and made the right decision. But those decisions will evolve over time, and having that kind of pulse and listening to what the community actually needs and how those community needs evolve over time, I think is one of the most important things that you know, new steering committee members coming in will need to do, and kind of bring some of those current perspectives to the committee as the committee's membership evolves.
That's
So
great.
sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
Susie. Okay.
Sorry, go.
So there's a speech I used to give, and we'll maybe start giving it again, for the release team. The kind of some of the things that we're talking about is like, what are we looking for in members, or what have we, you know, what have some of us done in the past? To Christoph's, like, you know, the latter points, like, part of the speech is like, you got to throw the book out. Not throw the book out entirely, but you know, the things that we had created in SIG release, so like some of the stuff like the handbooks, for example, right? Everything that we touch, everything that we do, they're living documents, they're living processes, right? So you need to come into this with that new perspective, right? And be willing to, like, I'm not gonna say shake things up is maybe the wrong turn of phrase, but like, being able to bring that perspective in and challenge and challenge existing writings, teachings, documentation, for the sake of improving the project, right? I think, you know, for the people that are here on this call, and really the people who are here on you know, in steering in general, you have a lot of people who are, you know, peering around corners, right? You know, their background in the project is, you know, across, you know, maybe they've done sub project ownership, and they've chaired SIGs for multiple, you know, or they've injected themselves into a lot of like glue work, right? If you look at the trends for steering, for example, right, you'll see that, you know, almost in every iteration of steering, you have someone from contributor experience, right? Who's like been a technical lead, been a chair of contributor experience, and that's a bit of a signal, right? It's the community is selecting people who are attempting to look after the community, right? Maintain the processes and procedures and the people who make the community run, right? So like in you know, in a new steering committee member, that's what I'm kind of looking for, right? I'm looking for someone who is projecting where the problems are going to be, peering around those corners and going like, this is a pattern, right? This is a pattern. This is happening because, like, when we're talking about, you know, I think the conversation across the last few years, and really the conversation hasn't stopped yet, and it won't stop for some time, is being burnt out, people being burnt out, right? And like thinking through That's, that's not just because of your home life. That's your work life. That's your open source life. That's your Kubernetes life, right? So looking at the patterns that emerge as people are working on, various areas of the project, right? Are we doing triage efficiently? Do the lion's share of work end up in a few people's hands day to day, right? How can we fix patterns like that, right? Is this working group, user group, sub project, SIG all together still functioning as it needs to, as it used to? Like, is it still meeting the what's written in its charter, right? Is that something that's worthy of reassessing, right? So those are some of the things that we look at, but like you have to, I think annual reports, for example, have been a good way for us to kind of get some of that feedback coming back into the committee. But like it also requires us to look at what the first time we put out the annual reports, it was kind of like, here are the things we need, is what we said to the SIG leads, right? And then it kind of evolved over time, and it's like, here's a template of the things we need. Like, let's make it easier for you to provide us the things in the ways that we need to see it. But even in the submission of those annual reports, you get to see stuff like how they speak about the work that they have day to day, right? Is it from the perspective of like, if I'm writing the annual report, I'm writing from the perspective of like, you have never seen the SIG subproject working group in your life. I want to present our content in a way that is manageable, that, and seeing it maybe presented as like, we did XYZ, or, there did this kept, and like, there's an opportunity for coaching, for teaching, of saying like, well, how can we present this in a way that is more palatable to someone who has no idea about, the I don't know, API machinery or something, right? So like, that's an opportunity for us to like interface with those leads, and maybe coach, maybe learn, right? But it does give us some signals into how they're thinking about their own work, and within the context of the larger project. And if you're not, then that's something to have a conversation about too, right?
Jordan?
I saw Jordan want to say something.
Yeah, I think a couple people touched on like representing the community, and I think that's good, especially when new members come on board. It's important to realize there's like a lot of different groups in the community. There's like the maintainers leads, who I think we have a lot of visibility to, because we're engaging with them a lot. And then there's sort of general contributors. They're not leading a SIG or a community group, but they're participating. And then there's like users and integrators, and really thinking through like, are all of those perspectives being represented in the direction of the project and the decisions we make? And we try to structure different parts of the project, the KEP process, and to get feedback from groups, but sort of at the steering level, trying to pay attention to like, are those processes working the way they're supposed to, or are things slipping through the cracks? Did we do something that really impacted users, and just maintainers are like, oh, this is awesome, we're deleting stuff, and like, our work is getting eher, and users are like, oh no, what are you doing? And not that the answer to that is always no, but like, was that managed well? And so one of the big reasons I put my hat in the ring for steering a couple of years ago was like, I'd done a lot of work on like backwards compatibility policies and things in like SIG architecture and API machinery and stuff, but realizing like, oh, there's a human component to that as well. And if you're not building this culture of like responsibility to the users who have built their businesses on Kubernetes, like a policy is only one pull request away from like getting rewritten and changed. And so like trying to engage both the technical policy side, but also the human, like, we have a duty to the people who are depending on us side. So just as new members come on, like, it's really easy to only focus on the leads and the contributors, because those are the people we work with all the time. and kind of forget like, oh no, we're representing and trying to help steer the project to continue serving the people, not just who participate, but who depend on it.
That's an awesome perspective to hear.
I'm gonna call out to Noah for a second. You'd mentioned that you might be running as well. Do you have any questions that you want to pose?
I think most of the questions that I have already been answered. I think the biggest thing is the distinction of what I mean, as a previously voting member, one of the perceptions I had about steering was that it was something that was going to be more technical, and understanding that it is more human, and that it's more based on decisions around the community and not as much decisions around the project as a repo, but the project as an ecosystem. I think it's great to highlight that, and frankly, should probably be highlighted in the election itself. But I think you've answered all of my questions. Though I guess it would be fair to ask from each of you, what is your actual time commitment in an average week?
I'll start since I talked about my calendar block. So I would say in an average week, there's usually a steering related meeting. There are 2 regular monthly meetings, and then there's occasional meetings. So I would say like 3 weeks out of 4, there's an hour devoted to steering. There's often some prep time for that. So it might be just 20 or 30 minutes, or it might be a couple hours. So on an average week, I would say there's probably a couple hours-ish directed towards steering meetings. And then I have that 2-hour block that's just for like my own work on my backlog. So in an average week, I would say about half a day for me.
I would say, yeah, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 hours or so a week on average. There are definitely some weeks that are heavier at different points in the cycle, like especially around annual reports. That's a fairly busy time where there's a lot more interactions with liaison, like being the liaison between steering and checking up with your various groups and that kind of stuff, kind of in the first quarter or so of the year. But yeah, I'd say on average, probably about, I'd even go maybe a little bit higher, like 6 to 8 hours a week. That's like specifically focused on steering stuff. With this similar kind of breakdown, at least as what Jordan said, as far as 1 to 2 hours maybe devoted to meetings specifically, but then a lot of the else is just Slack and GitHub and other things.
Yeah, Slack is hard to quantify. There's like threads that go in the background for days or weeks, and it's like, how do you quantify it? Like, I thought about this for 15 minutes 3 times this week while doing other things. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
there's plenty of the like, I'm doing the dishes, but I'm also contemplating a steering issue.
Yeah, I mean
it's
sorry,
maybe
go for it.
Steering specific, but something came up in a steering meeting, or you're thinking that something that came up in a meeting, maybe it should come up in a steering meeting, but you don't have all the context. So you got to go do some reading and poking and asking some questions, and then maybe it doesn't. So do you account that to steering or just general project visibility awareness? But I'd say for me, it's kind of there's a couple of modes. There's a big weight in weeks having a couple hours, and then there's plenty of weeks during the year where it's 10 plus hours. So there's kind of some variance there.
Yeah, I think there's I would agree on the time estimates, and I would say that I think the biggest chunk of time spent is that steering, the doing the dishes kind of thing, the wait a second, I think there's like a big project blob in my head where there's like you try to do the conspiracy theory map where you draw all the threads together. You're like, does this? So I mean, like, for context, I think, for any one of us, we're not just doing one thing. Maybe you're chairing a SIG and you're helping run a sub project, and so I'm on 2 steering committees and a governing board, and sometimes all of the dots connect, right? And sometimes it's related to internal work, right? So it's like hard to ascribe the time to just steering. Sometimes it's like, this is interesting if I talked about it in to-do group, but it also has to do with the OpenSSF. And then you're like, so yeah, I think the general time estimate is right on the money. But I think I think most of the time that we spend is the hardest times, or the crunch times, the emergent issues, because they are it's the attention that it requires sometimes, right? So the same if you were to talk to someone who is like a member of a code of conduct committee, right? Where they're the attention that's required at that moment is so important, right? It's not, yes, this is 20 hours that I can stretch over 4 weeks. It's 20 hours that I might have to give in the next 3 days to get this over the hump, right? So it's tricky to explicitly quantify all of that time, but I think the hardest moments are the ones that the attention needs to be on the issue right this second.
It's actually really similar to the security committee, I think, where there's like a rotation, and some weeks it's really quiet and those are great. It's like, here are the normal duties that take this much time, but then some weeks it's like, oh, we have a 0 day, and like, I'm going to spend 20 hours this week, like, coding and reviewing and shepherding and building and releasing and coordinating this 0 day. Like, the steering thing is sort of similar. Like, maybe 2 times a year or 3 times a year, there'll be like, nope, we have 10 hours of work to do this week. And those don't schedule and announce themselves conveniently. So if you're considering steering and you're so tightly booked that I can spare half a day a week, but no more on any given week, then yeah, I mean, like, yeah, this just to be aware of.
I mean, so something important to notice, that we are pretty good about coverage. It's never it's not necessarily 7 people giving that time explicitly at that one moment. It's like, hey, I'm going to, the person who is going to take the kids to do blah, and while they're doing that, you're going to look at this thing, and then I'm going to toss up a hack MD or something, and then when you come back, you look at right. So there's quite a bit of coordination, and like, we all have each other's personal contacts, and like and that kind of thing. So like, there's pretty good handoff when something emergent is happening. But it is definitely one of those. And again, CC, for example, you're having done the release team lead role, you're familiar with like, when something like starts falling apart, it's like, all right, I have to stare at this, and I have to make sure like all of the ducks are in the row, or like I can hand off to this person. So but we have pretty good coordination across the committee.
I do have one related question off that, and that is, you talk about the emergent issues and sometimes things might be urgent. Does anything ever come across steering's plate that says, no, get steering out of bed? Or is it something that, is there ever anything that can't wait until the morning? Or is there anything that's really urgent, like people are on the line?
I don't think we've ever had something that I know of that has been like, get people out of bed, because normally the things that steering is dealing with are more like long-term policy strategy kind of things. Like, normally the get people out of bed things are people who actually like hold the keys to particular things, like GitHub or Zoom or like different stuff like that. It's like, I've definitely been pinged in the middle of the night, but that's been more wearing my Contrivex team like tech lead hat as opposed to anything steering related that I can remember.
I would actually say like a third of the things that come to steering, we respond with, actually, like, thank you for letting us know, but this group over here, like whether it's code of conduct or security response or SIG architecture or contribx, like it's more just routing. Like, great that you're wanting to get eyes on this. We are not the right eyes. There's a team dedicated to this. So there's a fair amount of redirection for like urgent type issues.
Go next, and then Stephen. I was just pulling it up to see if it's still there because I think it's kind of relevant. And in the release team lead document, there's a time commitment section, and we literally say, like, before you volunteer, make certain that your employer and your family are okay with you spending a lot of time on this for the next 4 months, because it can be intense. And steering just doesn't quite tend to be that way. I mean, there are some things where like a ping will come by and you're like, oh, I got to go look at that, and we got to pay attention and see what's going on there. But we are an escalation point, so we're choosing to pay attention were something to come to us. But the things that do come to us are relatively limited in being a highly time sensitive thing compared to like security or conduct or an infra problem. Stephen?
Yeah, yeah, if anything, I would say the emergent stuff is coming from maybe connection points between groups that may not be part of Kubernetes. How can we make that connection quickly if someone needs to have a conversation about something? Otherwise, there is a lot of routing to the correct group within Kubernetes. But I would say in terms of like getting out of bed, like no, there's no getting out of bed. But there's a lot of what keeps you up at night. So you might not need to get out of bed for it.
I think one of the attributes of people who tend to come into these roles is that they worry a lot. And there are various things that, like, we want things to be good. We want them to be successful, sustainable, and they eat away at our brains outside of the time that we're in the meeting. So figuring out how to balance that can be a personal challenge, but it's also a good one a good skill to develop.
Yeah, that's great to know the the time estimation there, because as you mentioned, as the release lead, we have a handbook for the dedicated time, and the one important advice I got from the previous leaders is to update that time, to increase that time. Don't let people like overestimate the investment. But thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just curious, like as a follow-up question, like how the duties are spread between the members inside the steering committee. I understand like for annual report, it might like kind of like spread it like ahead of time. But for something like urgent, like how the duties would be kind of shared between the members.
This was one of my first questions when I joined, and I think it was Christoph who explained how things tend to work. I mean, there's a formal liaisons document that says which members liaison with which entities, but your question was more sort of like the emergent thing, how is it handled? And really, it's pretty pragmatic and egalitarian. I feel like in our Slack channel, we have a little bit of a chat about what the issue is and see who's available or not. I need to remind people in that Slack channel that I'm leaving this week on vacation, so I'm not around next week. So we try to do little things like that, and somebody will typically jump on it. But where I had said I would jump on something and then sent a message out on behalf of steering, I got reminded like, oh wait, we actually also still make sure that everybody agrees. So we draft a message together and make sure everybody's okay with the wording of the thing, and then it comes out on behalf of steering. So we do sort of federate things to who's available, but then also come back and make sure that we have appropriate consensus and that it's not one of us speaking on all of our behalfs without buy-in on it.
That's great to know. Like for something like I understand there might be like a private kind of channel or whatever to share like before make any announcement. But is there any like requirement? Say like 2/3 of people has to agree with those, or like that's like kind of hard restriction on there?
It depends. It honestly depends on what it is, who is there at the time. There are times where you may need to make a judgment call. I think in terms of a communication that's coming on behalf of steering, we try to be unanimous in that communication. There are instances where it is not something that is so controversial that you need that. It may be sufficient to say that, like, you know, we're working on X, or like you can track this issue here or there, right? In the emergent case, I think it is, and I mean, also just given the last X amount of time where people have, you know, had to either, you know, tend to personal stuff or tend to internal work, where you may not be able to build consensus with them because they are not available, right? So I think we walk into it having, you know, making sure we're upfront about our availability to you know, to weigh in on a situation. But I think that, you know, a good majority of the stuff that we do day to day is not a let me just see what Jordan is saying.
Sorry, I'm not trying to sub chat you.
Yeah. So again, yeah, like if it is if it's a on behalf of steering, we try to make sure that the message is the same and everyone agrees to it. Which is why I think for some scenarios, you know, you may wonder why there is maybe less content within a message, or emotion or something like that, right, within a message, and it's important for us to like state the facts, state how we're proceeding as a committee or a community, and let the next step happen. But I think, you know, in terms of who handles what on a day-to-day basis, it depends as well. You know, again, the liaison stuff has it, you know, it makes it clear for, I mean, I think like SIG specific work. I think there are some, you know, within the committee, there are some natural affinities based on the work that we may already be doing in other groups, that make it clear who might want to or need to work on it just for the sake of expediency, maybe. And really, we just, you know, if something's coming up, we toss it up in the air, make sure everyone is aware of it. If you see something first, you say the thing, and we figure out who needs to work on it next.
Thanks for sharing. I guess I got all my questions answered, and I guess that's also the initial idea why I came up with the combiner sim for like the previous release, because I do see the community is the combined power by like multiple contributors and from different kind of background. And as you were mentioned before, and it's great to know the community or steering members are willing to listen to all the feedbacks from everyone. Thank you.
We've got a bit of time still. Sergey or Rishi, any questions, or is there? I think, yeah, everybody else has chatted a bit on the call. Feel free to unmute and raise your voice. Well, we can also call it a bit early and give a few minutes back. And Rishi mentions in the chat, no questions, was thinking about nominating next year, perhaps was trying to get more of an idea. So yeah, that's fantastic. Great way to show up and start learning.
I think it's a good opportunity to remind folks that we have public steering committee meetings that happen every month. So we also have a scheduled private meeting that happens once a month, but the even parts of the private meeting are public. We basically focus on our private topics at the top of the hour, and once we've worked through that, the agenda flips over to a public recorded meeting. which is published later. So so please, if you are interested in steering, I would suggest check out the various issues that are tagged steering. Check out our check out the steering repo if you want to follow that. It is generally a low traffic repo compared to something like Jordan watching Kubernetes. It's definitely a different traffic flow. And then there's also the funding repo, right? So our content is within the community repo under the committee steering folder, the steering repo, and then the funding repo, which has all the discussions around funding various aspects of the project.
And for anybody who sees this recording in the future, or for any of y'all here, we have the steering committee Slack channel too. Feel free, we're humans, we're part of the project. Feel free to reach out to us, whether there or also if you want to DM any of us and ask a pointed question somehow, less visibly or you're uncertain. We're all here to serve the community. So definitely feel free to reach out to us at any time, and we'll do what we can to help.
Thanks for taking the time today, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day, everyone, and I will make sure that the recording gets posted to YouTube here eventually.
Later.